Welcome to Think Over Here, the show where we pop all over the world and talk about different peoples, cultures, and their stories. And today we have the Spooktabulous Spooktober edition because Halloween is coming up here in a couple of weeks. And not only that, remember this Halloween is that rare full moon, blue moon event. So be excited for that. But I wanted to talk a little bit about some more spooky aspects of culture in honor of Halloween. But I don't want to talk about anything too spooky because I don't want to scare anybody. You know? I'm trying to be your friend. And so the subject today is going to be about Bloody Mary. It's a classic kind of sleepover party game that tweens like to play here in the U.S. quite a bit. At least they did when I was growing up. So we're going to be talking about Bloody Mary. In a nutshell, that basically involves a ghost and going in a dark room to summon the ghost. So if that is going to trigger you, then I suggest not listening to this episode. But yeah, so that is what we're going to be talking about. And I guess one of the reasons that Bloody Mary stands out in my mind, so again, now that we have that disclaimer out of the way, let's go a little bit more in depth about what is Bloody Mary. And so Bloody Mary, it's this game. It's popular among just, again, kind of tweens, so kind of, that age from 10 to, 13, 14, right when you're stepping into teenagehood, you're trying to be brave, trying to do your own thing, you're trying to be cool with your friends. One of the cool things to do is to try to summon a ghost in your bathroom, because what else are you going to do when you're a tween? I mean, you can't drive a car. You can't go anywhere. So you may as well summon some spirit from the great beyond. And so the method of summoning Bloody Mary, there's as many different summoning methods as you want. It's customizable. You can do it however you want. But the basic premise of summoning Bloody Mary is basically you go into some... My recording closet all of a sudden just got a little darker. That was kind of spooky. But anyway, and so you go in a dimly lit bathroom, and so you can just kind of light it up with like a candle or a flashlight or something, but, just a dark bathroom. And then you stare into the mirror. Sometimes some people spin around several times, but you chant Bloody Mary or something along the lines of Bloody Mary, I've got your baby, or just basically chanting Bloody Mary. Sometimes you do it 3 times, sometimes you do it 13 times, however many times you want to do it. Sometimes you spin around, sometimes you flush the toilet. But again, what you're doing is you're staring in a dark mirror. And chanting Bloody Mary. That's the essence of the game. But of course, after you do this little ritual, something is supposed to appear in the mirror or behind you, and that it's supposed to be, Bloody Mary, and how she looks could be completely different. But Bloody Mary could be holding a bloody weapon or holding her head, or she'll scream at you or try to get you or try to pull you into the mirror, or reach out of the mirror and try to scratch out your eyes. Something spooky, scary like that. Oh yeah, so that was the basic premise of Bloody Mary. And honestly, and of course, anytime you play the game Bloody Mary, you have to tell the story of Bloody Mary. And again, there's as many different stories about Bloody Mary as there are versions of summoning her. Whether Bloody Mary was someone who died in a horrific car accident, someone who had their baby pass away tragically, someone who was burned at the stake as a witch. Weird people even go back talking about queens of England. So, and hopefully we can go a little bit in a deeper dive later on about some of these figures who are known to have inspired the legend of Bloody Mary later on. but I want to talk about my experiences. And so a lot of times, so kids get introduced to the game in school, or a lot of times again at sleepovers. And I guess sleepovers is a sensitive spot in my heart because growing up, I wasn't allowed to participate in any type of sleepover with friends. I couldn't invite friends over for sleepovers, and I definitely could not go to someone else's house for a sleepover. And that was because I guess my parents had some very negative experiences when they were growing up going to sleepovers. They didn't feel safe a lot of times playing some of these sleepover games like Bloody Mary. And my parents, they wanted to shelter us from some of those negative experiences. So I never actually played Bloody Mary. I remember, well, I never played it with friends or anything, but I remember trying it out myself because, you hear about this at school. And I remember going into our dark bathroom in our house and trying to do the ritual, but I was too scared. I could never do it. It was it was too scary for me. And again, also I grew up in a very conservative religious household, and so the idea of summoning a dark spirit was very, very frowned upon and was taught as being very, very real and very, very dangerous. And so the whole idea of doing that was very spooky. Now, granted, I did have my fair share of what I would consider sleepover games because how we got around the sleepover rule, no sleepovers, was that we would just have we would have parties. And so the rule was we can go to parties or we could have friends over for parties as long as the party ended at 10. And so basically we just had to squeeze in all these sleepover games before 10 p.m. And so even though I never played Bloody Mary, I did play a similar sleepover game growing up that I remember when I played it, I was more confused than scared. And how we got around to playing these sleepover games was we were allowed to have parties, and we were allowed to go to our friend's house for parties. We just weren't allowed to stay overnight. And so the party had to end at 10 p.m. So, of course, with friends, we were able to do some of these party games, sleepover games, before 10 p.m. And some of them entered in the line of that kind of spooky territory. And the one that I remember most, which is really weird because it even happened in my own house. And I remember my friends asking my mom if they could play it, and she let them, which is surprising me looking back because she must not have known exactly what the game was because there's no way she would have allowed it. Or I guess she was just feeling particularly generous that day. Who knows? I guess she knows. But what the game was I looked around on the internet. I couldn't find what it's called, but it's something like Pioneer Ashes or something like that. And the premise of what you do is it's similar to Bloody Mary, where you go into a dark bathroom just barely lit by a candle or something like that. And I remember having this girl, because for whatever reasons, I guess girls are attracted to the game Bloody Mary and similar games like these. And we can talk about that later. But yeah, so I was being led through this ritual by this girl in the bathroom, which sounds kind of bad. Anyway, but so I was in this dark bathroom with this girl being led through this ritual. And she was telling some sort of spooky story, and as part of the ritual, as she was telling the story, I had to reach my hands into a plate. And then later on the ritual, I had to touch my face as part of the ritual. And then all of a sudden, one of her friends would quickly turn on the light as I'm staring in the mirror, and when the lights turned on, I could see my face, and I could see that I had all this ash all over my face, and I was supposed to look like one of my ancestors, look like a pioneer. It was supposed to be like this shock jump factor. And I remember just being really confused because when they turned on the lights, I wasn't scared or anything. I was just like, why do I have ash all over my face? What's going on? And so, of course, what the setup is they put ash in that plate beforehand, and so you don't really feel it on your fingers. You can't see it. So you wipe it on your face, and then you turn on the light and then you have ash all over your face and they say, "Oh, spooky, it's scary," and then they laugh and that's the game, because again, you can't drive yet. So this is the most fun you're allowed to have. And so there you go. So that was the closest thing I ever got to Bloody Mary as a kid. But get excited, because for this podcast, I did try the game Bloody Mary by myself, and I'll tell you about that experience here in a bit. But enough about me and my random personal stories. I want to talk about a little bit about the history of Bloody Mary. And so I did a quick Wikipedia search, our good, reliable friend Wikipedia. And apparently nobody knows where the game Bloody Mary came from. However, there is some interesting history. Wikipedia points to an early game or divination ritual that young women would do in the early 19th century. And so what these young women would do, they would be in a dimly lit house and they would have a candle and a hand mirror. And what they were supposed to do is walk up a flight of stairs backwards while looking in the hand mirror. And as they were in this dark house looking in the mirror, they were supposed to be able to catch a view of their future husband's face in the mirror. Or if they didn't see their husband's face and rather they saw a skull or the Grim Reaper, that would mean that they would die before getting married. And so Wikipedia pointed that as kind of this early sort of mirror spirit ritual game that young women would do. And I just thought it was, kind of funny. I mean, a little bit dangerous, I guess, walking up a dark house staircase backwards, just holding a candle. But, if you're able to see your future husband's face, isn't it worth it? And one of the interesting things in that Wikipedia article is that it's highlighting that this was a game played by young women. And I guess in this case, it's less Bloody Mary and more like third grade cootie catcher fortune telling game. But again, they emphasize that was a game played by young women. And all my research looking through this Bloody Mary ritual game is they suggest that oftentimes this is a game played by young women. In my experience, I remember at these late night 10 p.m. parties that I would go to, that it was often the girls who was leading out on wanting to play the game, setting the game up, things of that nature. And so this caught my interest and also caught the interest of someone else. And so I read through this thesis, actually. So someone wrote a thesis. Her name was Laura Winter. And her thesis is titled Bloody Mary in the Mirror, a comparative examination of a living tradition. And so in her thesis, she actually talks a little bit about, she does this big deep dive. If you want to know about Bloody Mary, don't listen to this podcast. Go look up her thesis. That's the deep dive if you ever want it. More than you'd ever want to know about all the legends and stories of Bloody Mary. But she talks about this appeal to women. And I've also seen this in other places across the internet. And they also link this to women being associated with witchcrafts and joining covens and things like that. And one of the hypotheses is that women were often associated with witchcraft and, practicing those sorts of quote-unquote dark arts. And when women are practicing these quote-unquote dark arts, it's in the past, like the 18th, 19th centuries, when women, unfortunately, didn't have as many rights as they do today. Thank goodness that women have more rights today. And so historians often link women practicing witchcraft as a source of finding an alternate means of power, because if you know that your next door woman who is a witch, maybe she's not married, but she has powers, it gives her another form of power, another form of validating her in the community. Of course, unfortunately, it's unfortunate that many were harassed and persecuted for practicing their witchcraft or being accused as such. And so I've seen some things tossed around that this is still a thing going on with women today, which is possible. I don't think it's would be as big as a factor now, especially with more and more equal sexual and gender rights moving forward, but you never know. That's a hypothesis that I found was interesting. I also saw that kids like to play these games as a way of kind of going on a group adventure. Again, this is those tween years when you are just kind of stepping into making your own decisions, being your own person, and by and these are kids who are very dependent on their parents, very dependent on their teachers, but Bloody Mary and similar types of spooky games, these sleepover games, give them a chance to have these group adventures that a lot of people can find very healthy because it lets them to explore something that, it's relatively safe. We all know Bloody Mary isn't going to be jumping out of anybody's mirrors, but it lets them explore something on their own, something that they view as mysterious, dark, or dangerous, and it helps solidify them as a group. Of course, the reverse is also true, as is my experience, as was my mom's experience with sleepover games, how she felt very threatened and scared by these games. A lot of times these sleepover games can be used as forms of bullying or a power grab by certain kids in the group. So some kids in the group who already know about the game, who maybe were told about it from older friends or older siblings, they can use the game to scare their peers. So they're able to do the game because they already know all the secrets, they know what's going on, they're not afraid of it, so they can come across as really big, strong, brave, tough, and they can basically scare their friends, and that way they become a leader of the group. And of course if a kid doesn't want to do it because they're scared, then of course that child is written off as being a lesser member of the group. And so in that way these games can also be used as bullying tools. So something to be aware of. Just like, something to be aware of, just like Spider-Man. With great power comes great responsibility. These games, they can be used as a way to help solidify friendships as a fun adventure, or they can be used to create unhealthy power dynamics and bullying. As was the experience with my mother, which then led me to not being able to go to sleepovers as a kid, which brought me much anguish as I heard about all my friends' fun sleepovers. But alas, that's a personal problem, I guess. And now there's another crazy theory that I found. Well, there's another theory that makes quite some extraordinary claims that I found as I was researching these Bloody Mary history. And this theory was proposed by Alan Dundes, and he proposed that these games are played by tweens and especially young girls because he sees the Bloody Mary game as a coming of age ceremony of sorts, as a ritual in preparation, and as a way to understand menstruation. Obviously, there are some parallels, with bleeding and things and the like, and he also mentions that in some of these Bloody Mary rituals, it involves flushing the toilet, and so he reviewed all of that as ways of coming. He viewed all that as a way of kind of a poetic understanding of menstruation. I personally don't put much stock into that theory, but if you're into sort of those more Freudian ideas, you can look up his work there. But who knows? Maybe there is something to it, or maybe that explains partly why the Bloody Mary ritual is always taking place in bathrooms. Or maybe some kid found some blood in a bathroom and that sparked the inspiration for how did this blood get how did this blood get here in the bathroom? Maybe it was from a mirror, witch, spirit, ghost, monster. Who knows how all this all ties together? But again, I don't put much stock into those Freudian ideas. I do think it's interesting that the Bloody Mary ritual always seems to occur in bathrooms because, again, we're talking about these tweens. They have access to the bathroom. It's usually one of the darkest places in the house as it doesn't have outside as it's more likely not to have an outside window. You have these big mirrors. It's familiar. It's also kind of, when it's dark, it's kind of this creepy place. It's wet and humid sometimes. It's a perfect spot in order to perform this ritual when you don't have access to go anywhere or access to any tools or anything. And of course, the idea of mirrors in kind of ghosts and these rituals is, of course, very strong. The folklore around mirrors is tremendous, with, mirrors being gateways to the spirit world, being able to see spirits or having spirits trapped in mirrors, having mirrors fog up mysteriously, seeing the faces of deceased ones in mirrors, or putting a mirror under somebody's nose to check if they're alive or dead, see if they're breathing and condensation forms on the mirror. There's tons of different associations with mirrors and death. And so I think that it makes sense that the mirror becomes incorporated here into this children's game. And so I want to talk a little bit about the psychology around this game. Why is it spooky to go into a dark bathroom and look in a mirror and say the name Bloody Mary multiple times until you get so scared that you run out of the bathroom, or maybe see the ghost? And we were just talking about mirrors, and I think it is interesting because when you look in a mirror, it does provide an opportunity to see yourself in the world. It lets you to see behind you. It lets you see where you can't see, where you are vulnerable. When you look in a mirror, especially in a dark room, you can see behind you, but yet you still can't see very far. And so what it is doing is it's letting you see that your vulnerable space, and it gives you that sense of being able to see it. And you could see if something is coming, but yet you would still not be able to do anything about it. It puts you in a feeling of helplessness. And also, when you're looking in the mirror, staring at yourself, you begin to pick up on features that maybe you never noticed before. And in that dark room, looking in the mirror, different portions of your body may stand out in weird ways that you usually don't notice. And so you yourself look different in that moment, kind of giving you that feeling of not quite really being there or being part of a different world, this bridge or something. So I totally get why mirrors are associated with it, especially being in a dark room. And there's some interesting things, because if you actually do play Bloody Mary and you actually do finish the ritual before running out in panic, because that's what I did. Anytime I tried to play Bloody Mary by myself, I couldn't finish it because I got too scared. But if you are able to finish, there are actually some illusions that can take place. And one of those is called troxler fading. And what this illusion does is when you stare, you can actually Google this. If you look up troxler fading or the lilac chaser illusion, you can see this in action. Or you can stand in a dark bathroom, a dimly lit bathroom, and stare at your face for a little bit, and you'll be able to see this illusion, but a scarier version of it. But what happens is when you stare at a fixed point, things around that point actually begin to disappear. So stationary things around that fixed point will begin to disappear. So if you are standing in a dimly lit bathroom, staring at your face, just right there at the end of your nose, you do that long enough, parts of your face will actually start to kind of blur and fade and twist and distort together as portions of your face actually kind of start to fade away. And as part of my research for this podcast, I actually did that. And it is a very interesting phenomenon. And it is actually kind of spooky. Just as you're staring at yourself and you see the light of the candle reflecting in your eyes. And then all of a sudden, your face just starts to morph and change and fade. It's a very interesting phenomenon. It can be scary. And the other thing is when you're sitting in that dark bathroom, humans are hardwired to notice faces. If you go looking at cloud gazing, you oftentimes you see faces in the clouds, or people find faces in foods. Everybody's talking about the corn chips shaped like Abraham Lincoln, or things like that. The same thing happens in the dark, and so as you're staring in the mirror in the dark, you begin to see faces around you. Again, in those vulnerable portions where you can't do anything about it. And so the effect of having your face begin to fade away, the effect of seeing faces behind you, leads to a very creepy feeling, perfect for a tween sleepover on Halloween night. On the full moon. Ooh. And so I thought it was interesting. I actually wanted to see this in action, because I was always a chicken playing the game, and I was glad to be able to do it. And then when I called out for Bloody Mary, nothing happened. But the scariest thing was seeing those kind of optical illusions, just standing there in that bathroom and watching your face kind of distort a little bit. That was an interesting experience. And as I mentioned before, there's 1,000 different ways of summoning Bloody Mary, and there's probably 1,000 different Bloody Mary ghosts. And in my research, I found there's two common ones. Usually, Bloody Mary is named Mary Worth, and she could be either a witch that was burned during witch trials. It could be a young girl who was murdered. It could be a young girl who was in a terrible car accident and mutilating her face. It could be a girl whose baby was killed in some tragic ways. Or I saw lots of accounts about a Mary Worth, who was a lady who was living in Illinois near Chicago during the Civil War, and she was accused as being a witch. And she was also part of the reverse Underground Railroad, where you had the Underground Railroad where slaves were escaping to the north, to the free states. But what she was doing was she would lure African Americans who were seeking freedom, basically capture them and take them back to the slave states and sell them back as slaves. And so it was a reverse Underground Railroad. And so I saw her story pop up quite a bit. I also saw a very popular version of Bloody Mary is Queen Mary I, or Mary Tudor. I really don't think that this is the Bloody Mary that most tweens would be talking about, because she was the first queen of England, and the reason that she was known as Bloody Mary is simply due to these religion reformations, the Marian persecutions, and she was Catholic, and she basically had a bunch of Protestants burned at the stake. So I don't see a lot of credence there. But the other interesting thing, too, is that Bloody Mary is often associated with having a baby. But Queen Mary I, she does have this interesting history of being what people believe now to be afflicted with pseudocyesis, which is become more commonly known as a false pregnancy. You see, because in Queen Mary's life, she often wanted to have a child. And she also had some very negative experiences around children and heirs, considering that her father was King Henry VIII, who was famous for all the terrible weddings and deaths as he was trying to find an heir for his kingdom. And so Queen Mary had a lot of conflicting feelings, I guess, a lot of trauma with childbirth. But essentially what happens with false pregnancy is it's believed that if you can basically trick your body into thinking that it's pregnant. So if you believe sincerely enough and hard enough that you are pregnant, you can actually experience symptoms of pregnancy, including swelling of your abdomen, swelling of the breasts. You can even feel fetal movements. You can undergo changes in your period cycle, things along that nature, simply through believing sincerely enough that you're pregnant. And then what can also happen is if you believe it enough, your body can actually start to secrete those pregnancy hormones that's actually giving you those physical symptoms. So you can go through the whole pregnancy without a fetus. And this was historically documented to have happened to Queen Mary I, where she experienced these pregnancy symptoms, but then they reversed with no child born. And so she became associated with this unborn baby. And then, of course, that compiled with the Protestant killings, it gave her this kind of spooky feel that I guess has been capitalized by tween girls. But so I don't put Queen Mary as being the mother of the Bloody Mary, but it's more that they have similar names and then became associated with each other. I think it's more this Mary Worth, who is, a fill-in name for whichever creepy urban story you want to tell to go along with your Bloody Mary. So you can tell any creepy story, name her Bloody Mary, and summon her in the mirror. I did think it was interesting in that thesis by Laura Winter. She described that in her peer group, they all thought that when they were summoning Bloody Mary, that they were actually summoning the Virgin Mary. And the Virgin Mary wouldn't pop out and try to get them or scare them or anything, but rather she would cry tears of blood for seeing, her son Jesus crucified. And I guess that was scary enough for them and a Catholic school to see the Virgin Mary crying tears of blood. And so it's interesting. Again, it just shows the flexibility of these urban stories, these urban legends, these sleepover games, especially when they're in the hands of children, because children will change the story to document their own experiences, document the Marys they know around them, document the spooky stories that they have heard, and they all become combined into this ritual. Because most children aren't afraid of changing the facts to make the story better, to make the game funner, to make the story spookier. And so children will take that base underlying urban legend and do whatever they want to do with it. And so that's why we see so many different versions of Bloody Mary. We see so many different versions of the legend, of the game, and it's basically impossible to track when it all started. But it seems that the pop culture type of game of summoning a ghost in the mirror by calling out Bloody Mary probably started right around the 1970s. But who started it and why, we don't know, but that's when it started to be spread around the United States. And so we see that these stories move on. And so there you go. There's kind of your deep dive, my thoughts, history of Bloody Mary. Hope some of that was interesting. Sorry if I get a little bit rambly. It's always hard to carry a conversation by oneself, I need to get some friends over here and be able to talk about things with them, make it a little bit easier. But anyway, we need to go to the question bowl, but I am going to forego the question bowl today because in honor of Spooktabulous Spooktober Halloween, I want to simply describe to you one of my Halloween costumes. You can imagine I pulled the question from the question bowl. What was your worst Halloween costume? And my worst Halloween costume was a shovel. I dressed up as a shovel. What we did was my wife at the time, and my son, we dressed up in kind of this themed Halloween thing. It was very last minute, and so we just had to make costumes just with whatever we had. So we had our son, who was just a baby at the time. He dressed up as a fireman. My wife at the time, she dressed up as a forest fire. I dressed up as a shovel. So it was a terrible costume. I basically just had a brown bed sheet that I wrapped around me, and I made this head out of aluminum foil, kind of a shovel hat. I put that on my head, and there you go, shovel. And then we had this giant teddy bear that we dressed up as Smokey the Bear. So we were kind of this forest fire Smokey the Bear team. And so, you know, it was a cute theme, but my costume was absolutely terrible. Nobody figured out that I was a shovel. Everybody always thought that I was trying to go for like the Pope or something. and to their credit, I definitely did not look at all like a shovel. So there you go. There was my worst Halloween costume. And so I hope that you stay safe in this spooktabulous Spooktober time. I hope you make a better costume than me, and I hope that if you do play any spooky sleepover games that you stay safe and have fun. Until next time, ciao.